Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I'm going to continue what I started in the last episode, which is sharing ghost stories narrated by the person who actually experienced the ghost. I've found a few articles that talk about how rare it is to find these kinds of stories. Most ghost stories, they say, come at second hand or third hand or fourth or fifth. To tell you the truth, I didn't have that tough a time finding these. But then again, I have the advantage of online word-searchable archives to hunt through. The story I'm going to read you now is titled A Dream and Recollections of a Haunted House. It appeared in Light magazine in 1882. And this does something very unusual. I really don't know that I've ever seen this before. It identifies who the narrator is. We'll be hearing the story of Mrs. S. Pickering, now residing at 9 Albert Terrace, Camden Road, N. But of course, that was in 1882. Here now is the really creepy story shared by Mrs. Pickering. In the summer of 1842, I dreamt that I was living in a large country house and that I had charge of some children. In this dream, I saw a man drag a woman off a bed by her hair and shut her up in a closet in the wall. This dream recurred night after night. I remember I used to speak to my husband about it and about its frequent recurrence. But after the autumn, I was not troubled with it, and it gradually passed from my mind. In November 1849, my husband died. And being obliged to go out into the world, I engaged myself to take the place of head nurse in a family residing at Little Kimber Grange, near Great Kimber in Lincolnshire. On going down to my new duties, the house seemed familiar to me. It was exactly the house of my dream of 7 years before. Entrance hall, staircase, corridors, all corresponded to my dream. An attendant took me upstairs. On taking a seat, a feeling of dreariness and faintness, such as I had never before felt, came over me. This went off upon my taking the refreshment which the attendant brought and placed before me. She then introduced me to what she said was the day nursery, and there left me to make further arrangements for me. As I sat at the fireplace, resting my arm on the guard fender, thinking of my new position, a green baize door opposite me slowly opened. And there stood a gentleman in evening dress, who, holding the handle of the door, gazed steadily at me for what seemed a long time. When the attendant, returning, he withdrew, at the same time closing the door after him. I remarked to her that the master had been there, but had not spoken, and that I thought it strange, as he must know that I was the new nurse. She answered that it was not the master, for he was at dinner and the second course was only just served. Before the day was over, I learned that the house was subject to noises, bell ringings, etc. At night, a few minutes before 11, there were thumping sounds in the kitchen. Doors were strained as if about to be burst open. Footsteps were heard in the passages and on the stairs. The servants said that the place was haunted, that the gentleman I had seen on my arrival was the ghost of mistress's first husband. Some of the servants said that they had also seen him. They said they did not mind. They had got familiar with such things. When my mistress got used to me, she told me that her former husband died in 1842, 2 years after marriage, and that ever since the house had been troubled with noises. She also told me that at his last illness, as his end approached, he whispered to her that he wanted to unburthen his mind of something. She stooped to hear, but he could not speak. She got pencil and paper, but he could not write, and so he died without imparting his secret. She also told me that before his death she had discovered that he had had a mistress in the place for some years, and that she had suddenly disappeared. I could not sleep at nights. At times the noises were so disturbing that I had to get up and light my lamp when they would cease. There was one room, it was said, where no lamp would continue alight. In a back kitchen there were, near the floor, some bricks that could not be kept in place. However often the bricklayer set them, they gradually loosened and fell out again. The cause of this was never made out. There were rumors about it associated with the history of the previous master, but being only rumors, I will not mention them. I could not keep my place long. Yeah, understandable. I had some friends over a while back, and we gathered around the YouTube fire. We don't have a fireplace. And we read some of these stories aloud. When this one was read, there were a lot of winces and raised eyebrows and a lot of tension. So thank you, Mrs. Pickering, and thank you for being brave enough to share your name with us. We don't know the name of the person who tells the next story. It's titled The Middy's Story, middy being a slang term for midshipman, and it appeared in an 1879 issue of The Theosophist. Allow me to tell you of a personal adventure of mine when I was a midshipman on board Her Majesty's frigate. One of the sailors in the larboard watch had been washed overboard in a storm as he was clinging to life to one of the boats. The affair had been quite forgotten when a hue and cry was raised that there was a ghost near this boat, and none of the men would go near the place after dark. Several, if not all of the men, had seen it. I laughed at the story, however, for I had not a whit of confidence in these nonsensical tales of ghosts. So some of our mess, who pretended to have seen the apparition, dared me to go up to it at night and accost it. I agreed to go and took my revolver, loaded, with me. When at the appointed hour I came near the boat, there certainly did seem to be a mist or shadow which looked like a man, and this shadow turned and looked at me. I did not give it time to look twice before I fired 2 shots at it. Imagine, if you can, my feeling when the shadow gently glided under the boat, which was bottom upwards, and disappeared. When this thing looked at me, I cannot tell you why, but I felt quite cold and odd, and if it was not a ghost, it looked very like one. At any rate, I had had enough of shooting at it. My adventure, of course, greatly deepened the superstitious feeling among the sailors, and so, as the spectre was seen again the next night, they just tossed the boat overboard, and then they were never troubled further. It's such a strange story. First of all, there's the conversion from being a skeptic to being a believer, which seemed to happen just instantaneously, and he brought his gun. This is something that I keep running into in these Victorian chronicles, particularly of ghost hunters, is they bring firearms. Now, it might have been due to stories, perhaps fanciful stories, but stories about criminals staging a haunted house to keep meddling neighbors away from their center for smuggling or counterfeiting or any other illegal activity. But in many cases, this one included, I have no idea what the thinking was. Why shoot at a ghost? And if it's somebody pulling a prank, you shouldn't shoot them. Maybe it tells us something about Victorian culture, that it was sort of the Wild West. I don't really know what to do with that, so I'm just going to move on to the next story. This is another very short, very weird story, but weird in a different way. It was also published in the magazine Light, this one in 1899, and its only title is Mr. J. Neville Maskelyne. I am one of the few who, having passed through the valley of the shadow, have returned. Bathing in a canal, I was carried out of my depth, and, after the usual period of struggling, I was drowned. Saving my subsequent resuscitation, I was, to all intents and purposes, dead. I am painfully aware of the fact that there are some persons in the world who would rather I had remained so, but it was not to be. As far as my experience goes, drowning is by no means an unpleasant death. After the first few seconds, it is quite painless. One has not much time for reflection or introspection, and I am compelled to admit the unpoetical truth that all the past events of my life did not crowd through my memory in those few moments. One thing, however, did appear to my mental vision as plainly as though it were actually before my eyes. That was the form of my mother, engaged upon her household duties. Upon returning home, I was utterly astonished to find that she had been as conscious of my danger as I had been of the occupation in which she was engaged at the moment when I was so near death. There are, of course, innumerable records of such occurrences in which a mutual influence appears to be exercised between mind and mind. Whether or not it may be possible to establish any physical law bearing upon the subject, I cannot say. But to me, this mental action during times of stress and danger, call it telepathy or what you will, is bound to remain an indisputable fact, which no amount of reasoning can explain away. Now, if a crisis apparition story is a ghost story, then clearly this is a ghost story. And with this episode and the previous one, I've been looking at ghost stories told by the people who were actually involved and actually experienced the ghost. Well, here's a story told by the ghost. This was an unusually short episode, so I want to toss in one more thing. This is not a ghost story, but it is about the telling of ghost stories. It comes from Cassell's Book of the Household, a work of reference on domestic economy, Volume 4, so this is a pretty long work. It's basically advice to housewives, an awful lot of advice to housewives. Here's what this writer has to say about gathering around a fire and telling ghost stories. What more pleasant in the long 4 nights of winter than for young and old to gather round the parlor fire? There is music out of doors, however, the music of the wild wind in the swaying trees, while the withered creepers keep tapping on the glass in every lull of the conversation. An anecdote or two told, for example, about the homing instinct of cats will lead to many such stories, and then to tales of bird and dog life, and before the evening is over, suggested perhaps by some mysterious knock heard in the hall or upstairs, the conversation may end in a few old wives' ghost stories. Of course, not a soul in the circle believes in apparitions, but the tales about them are very thrilling nevertheless. I include this along with the 25 ghost stories that I've collected from various Victorian books and magazines on a website. If you'd like to visit, it's ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. There you can find all the materials you need to do what I've done, which is invite your friends over and gather around a fire of one form or another. Share some baked goods, share some mulled wine, and of course, share some ghost stories. And you can find those ghost stories at ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. I'm Tim Prossel. Thank you very much for listening.